Officer Grant was pounding so hard on my front door I thought he was going to break it off the hinges. "Open up, now!" he shouted, loud enough that neighbors' lights started flicking on one by one. In that split second, standing barefoot in my hallway, all I could think was, what the hell did the HOA tell him this time? I pulled the door open with a jolt, and there he stood. Tall, rigid, jaw clenched so tightly the muscles near his temples twitched. His uniform looked sharper than usual, like he'd come here ready for a fight. His eyes didn't even blink when he barked, "You Ethan Walker?" As though he expected me to deny my own name. Cold air rushed past him into my home, mixing with the heat boiling inside my chest. "Yes, I'm Ethan," I said, confused and half asleep. "What's going on?" His answer slapped me harder than his knock. "HOA President Caroline Mercer contacted us. She's filed a report stating you've been uncooperative, verbally aggressive, and are refusing compliance with multiple orders." His voice carried no emotion, just that rehearsed firmness officers use when they believe they're dealing with trouble. For a moment, I couldn't even feel my toes on the concrete. The shock, the humiliation, the ridiculousness of it all, it crashed over me at once. "Aggressive?" I repeated, stunned. "I haven't even spoken to her today." But he wasn't listening. Or maybe he was, but the story Caroline spun had already framed me as the villain. A dog barked in the distance, somewhere down the street, and the echo made my heartbeat feel louder. My own pulse throbbed in my ears, and the porch light above us buzzed like it was about to burn out. Then I saw her. Caroline Mercer, standing across the street like a general surveying a battlefield. Arms crossed, chin raised, face calm in that smug, calculating way she had perfected. She didn't even pretend to look surprised or concerned. She watched like she'd pressed a button and was waiting for the machine to perform exactly as designed. "Ma'am says you're refusing to follow HOA compliance orders," Officer Grant continued, his tone flat. "She wants immediate action taken. She says you've been confrontational and intimidating toward her." I nearly laughed, part disbelief, part fury, but the officer's posture told me that wouldn't help. I swallowed it down. "With all due respect, officer, this is a misunderstanding. Caroline and I have a disagreement over a patio shade color." "That's it." He shifted his weight and glared at me like he wasn't buying a word of it. "Look, I don't care about the shade or the color or whatever this mess is. But she filed the complaint, and when an HOA president claims a resident is becoming hostile, we have to respond. Hostile. Aggressive. Dangerous. She was painting me as a threat. Over a shade. A beige shade. Part of me wanted to unleash everything I knew. To tell him her report was full of procedural violations. That she'd skipped quorum votes, fabricated rule changes, and had been targeting me for weeks. My legal training was practically burning its way up my throat, but revealing it now felt premature. Caroline would only twist it into another weapon. Officer Grant stepped closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "Listen," he said, eyes sharp but softer than before. "This isn't going away. She's pushing this as far as she can, and you need to be prepared for what comes next." A chill crawled up my spine. "What do you mean?" He leaned in, glancing past me into the dim hallway behind me. "This," he whispered, "is just the beginning." Caroline marched up my driveway shouting, "I'm writing you up, Ethan," over a patio shade, a shade color she knew was previously approved. Long before Officer Grant banged on my door like he owned the place, this entire storm had started with Caroline Mercer stomping across my lawn like she was the self-appointed sheriff of our neighborhood. I remember stepping outside that afternoon, coffee in hand, expecting nothing more than a quiet moment to enjoy the breeze. Instead, I found Caroline standing on my porch, lips pressed into a tight line, holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. Before I could even greet her, she slapped a bright yellow violation notice onto my door with the kind of force you use when slamming a courtroom gavel. "Unapproved exterior modification," she declared, her voice loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. My patio shade, beige, simple, unobtrusive, hung exactly where it had been for years. It had been approved by the previous board, and she knew that. Everyone knew that. What is this supposed to be? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though frustration crawled up my neck. The paper fluttered slightly in the breeze, mocking me with its absurdity. Caroline didn't even look at the shade. She didn't care. Her eyes were locked on me, not the fabric. There are new standards, and you're out of compliance. She said it coldly, like she had been waiting for the moment she could finally say it. From that day on, everything about her behavior felt personal. She didn't treat me like a homeowner under her governance. She treated me like an obstacle she needed to remove. Neighbors walking their dogs avoided our sidewalk when she was around. People pretended not to see her because any eye contact risked drawing her attention. And her wrath. I didn't understand it at first. I didn't understand why a simple patio shade had ignited this fire inside her. But I felt the shift. The quiet hostility. The subtle intimidation. This isn't necessary, I told her. It was approved. You know it was. She stepped closer, the heels of her shoes digging into the concrete with deliberate pressure. That's irrelevant now. I'm the one enforcing the standards, she said. If you don't comply, you'll face fines, and hearings, and forced compliance if needed. Forced compliance. The phrase stuck with me like a splinter. Who talks like that about a patio shade? Who uses threats over fabric? I wanted to argue, to stand my ground, but in that moment, all I could feel was disbelief. Real, heavy disbelief that the woman in front of me cared more about asserting control than being truthful. I'd dealt with difficult people before, but Caroline's intensity was different. Sharp, personal, calculated. Looking back, that first violation notice was the spark that lit everything that followed. The escalating harassment, the fabricated reports, and eventually the police officer pounding on my door at 6 in the morning. It all traced back to this moment. The first shot she fired in a war I didn't even know I was in. As she turned to leave, she paused at the edge of my walkway, glanced over her shoulder, and lowered her voice so only I could hear. I always win here, she whispered, and then she walked away, leaving a storm behind her. I woke up to the sound of duct tape ripping. 3 violation letters were being slapped onto my front door like warning posters. Caroline didn't even bother pretending it wasn't personal. I froze halfway down my staircase when I saw the shadows through the frosted glass. 2 members of the architectural committee, Caroline's loyal sidekicks, were standing on my porch in their matching HOA windbreakers. They took turns smoothing bright notices across my door, each one taped with the same careless aggression Caroline had shown that first day she confronted me. I didn't even have time to open the door before they walked off briskly, not even glancing back, as if marking my house like this was a routine task. The smell of fresh adhesive hit me the moment I stepped outside. 3 new citations. 3. All for different so-called violations. One claimed my landscaping was unmaintained, even though I had trimmed the hedges the night before. Another accused me of creating an unauthorized exterior obstruction, whatever that meant. And the third? Recurrent non-compliance, a vague term they seemed to use whenever they needed something to stick. That morning set the tone for the weeks that followed. Every day, new letters appeared on my door. Fence, mailbox, even tucked under my windshield wipers. The HOA wasn't simply enforcing rules. They were declaring me the neighborhood problem, their personal project. I would catch glimpses of people taking photos of my windows, my yard, even the side of my garage. Sometimes they didn't even try to hide it. A quick flash, a click, and then they'd disappear around the corner. The worst part was the sudden appearance of new rules. Freshly printed guidelines slipped into my mailbox without community votes or notices. Yet every single rule seemed suspiciously designed to target something about my property. Shade fabric restrictions, window, visibility guidelines, parking limitations that affected only my driveway layout. Caroline had found a loophole in the system. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was creating them on the fly. I felt the shift deep in my bones. My home, my sanctuary, no longer felt like a safe place. It felt like a spotlight had been hung above it, shining down with relentless scrutiny. Every time I stepped outside, I sensed eyes on me. Curtains moved, phones angled, conversations hushed as I passed. This wasn't random. This wasn't over a shade. This was coordinated harassment. My legal instincts started kicking in. I recognized patterns: manufactured violations, selective enforcement, procedural manipulation. I had seen similar tactics during my work in municipal compliance, but back then, I was on the side investigating them, not suffering through them. That irony twisted inside me every single day. I started documenting everything: timestamps, photographs, notes, patterns, and how the citations appeared. I knew I needed evidence, because instincts alone wouldn't be enough to protect me. And somewhere underneath the anger and humiliation, a small voice kept whispering that this was going to escalate to a level even Caroline wasn't prepared for. But the tension didn't just rise, it started suffocating. The walls of my own home felt tighter. Nights became restless, filled with the fear of what letter might be plastered outside by morning. I had no idea how far Caroline was willing to go, but her determination made something very clear. She wasn't backing down. Then one afternoon, a knock came. Not loud, but heavy. When I opened the door, a mail carrier handed me a certified envelope. Notice of enforcement action, the label read. My stomach dropped. Everything was about to get worse. Officer Grant stormed up my driveway yelling, "We're not doing this again." I hadn't even stepped outside yet. Someone was feeding him lies in real time. I froze halfway to the door when I heard the thud of his boots pounding against the concrete. I'd barely processed the certified letter from the HOA when his voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade. My front window rattled when he hit the door with his fist. I swung it open before he could strike it again, and the fury in his eyes hit me harder than the noise. "What now?" I asked, already exhausted by whatever story Caroline had spun this time. "She says you've been threatening the community," Grant snapped, pointing a finger at me like a parent scolding a child. His voice was low but strained, as if he'd been dragged into something he didn't want to deal with. "You yelled at her, slammed your door in her face, made her feel unsafe. She says you've been causing disturbances all morning." I blinked. "I haven't even left my house today." He exhaled through his teeth, jaw tight. He knew something was off. His face said it. But protocol forced him into the role. He was playing. He had to respond, no matter how absurd the complaint was. The sun bore down on us, heating the concrete to the point where the warmth seeped through my shoes. The scent of fresh-cut grass drifted from somewhere down the street, mixing with the sharper scent of Caroline's perfume as she appeared at the end of my driveway. "There he is," she said loudly, as if announcing me to an audience. She marched toward us with that same arrogant confidence she wore like armor. "Officer, thank you for coming again. I told you he'd escalate." Grant's back straightened, but not for her. It seemed more like irritation tightening his shoulders. "Ma'am," he said curtly, "I'm talking to him right now." Caroline ignored his tone and planted herself beside him, chin raised. "You need to cite him. I've had enough. Our community shouldn't feel threatened." I stared at her, stunned. "Threatened? Caroline, all I did was send you a request for proper documentation of the violations. That's it." Her eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of something else. Fear, maybe, buried beneath the bravado. She opened her mouth to speak, but I stepped forward and addressed Grant directly. "Officer, for the record, under state HOA governance statutes, a homeowner has the right to request documentation and verification of all citations issued." The words came out calmly, but deliberately. I wanted him to hear the precision in my tone. And any attempt to retaliate after such a request is considered procedural misconduct. Grant stopped mid-breath. His eyebrows rose slightly, not in shock but in recognition. He knew I wasn't bluffing. A shift happened right there between us, subtle but undeniable. He glanced at Caroline, who suddenly seemed less certain of her choreography. "That's so," he muttered, half to himself. Caroline shot me a glare sharp enough to cut glass. The sun grew hotter. The air thickened. I could almost taste the tension settling between the three of us. Then Grant leaned closer to me, lowering his voice. "Are you recording this incident?" he asked. Caroline pointed at me and yelled, "You don't know the law, Ethan." That was the moment I snapped. "Yes, Caroline. I actually do." The words came out before I could stop them, fueled by a mix of anger, humiliation, and the exhaustion of being painted as the villain in a story she kept rewriting. Officer Grant's question still hung in the air, whether I was recording the incident, but Caroline's accusation cut through everything. Her voice carried down the street, loud enough that blinds shifted and curious eyes peeked out from behind curtains. For weeks I had held back. I had bitten my tongue, told myself to stay calm, to avoid escalating the situation. But something inside me cracked. Maybe it was the way she stood there, acting invincible. Maybe it was the lies she repeated so confidently. Or maybe it was the realization that she wasn't going to stop unless I pushed back. I stepped forward, the heat of the sun settling heavily on my shoulders, and looked straight into her eyes. "I'm not just some homeowner you can bully," I said, my voice low but unshaking. "I spent years in municipal compliance. I trained as a paralegal. I know exactly which parts of your story don't add up." Grant's posture shifted almost instantly. The irritation in his face faded, replaced by something more cautious, more respectful. His arms eased from that defensive fold and his expression softened as if he'd just discovered he'd been reading from the wrong script. Caroline, on the other hand, froze. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. For the first time since this nightmare began, she didn't look so sure of herself. She tried to mask it, lifting her chin, narrowing her eyes, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. She gripped her clipboard so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Officer," I continued, turning to Grant, "under our state's HOA transparency laws, any resident is entitled to request proof of violations, meeting minutes, and the specific rule changes being used to justify enforcement, none of which Caroline has provided." Grant glanced at her sharply. "Is that true?" Caroline's voice came out thin. "He's twisting it. He doesn't understand the context. The board approved." "The board didn't approve anything," I cut in, "because there hasn't been a properly noticed meeting in months. No quorum, no member vote, no record of any amendment. You've been issuing violations based on rules you created yourself." Her face flushed deep red. The anger in her expression wasn't the same confident rage she usually wielded. This was panic, raw and unfiltered. Her breath caught slightly and she took a step back without meaning to. She knew I wasn't bluffing. She knew I had her cornered. The scent of her sharp floral perfume mixed with the cut grass in the air, but underneath it all I could sense something else. Fear. It radiated off her in waves. And for the first time, I felt my own strength rising, solid and unshakable. I'd spent weeks feeling hunted, cornered, powerless. But the truth had weight, and she felt every ounce of it. "This is harassment," I said firmly. "Targeted, intentional, and completely outside the bounds of your authority." Caroline swallowed hard. She didn't have a comeback. Not this time. I took one more step forward, my voice steady and deliberate. "And the worst part," I said quietly, "is that you violated something you hoped I'd never find." A crumpled document was shoved under my door with the words, "Keep quiet." That's when I knew Caroline was hiding something serious. I stared at the message for a long moment. The ink slightly smeared as if whoever delivered it had sweaty hands. The paper felt damp, handled too many times, and the handwriting wasn't familiar. I unfolded it slowly, expecting another violation notice, but what I saw stopped me cold. It was a partial printout from the HOA's internal records, bylaw amendments I had never seen before, rules I had never heard about, and dates that made absolutely no sense. My pulse spiked. I walked to my kitchen table, spreading the crumpled sheet out under the light. The amendments were supposedly passed 3 months ago, Yet the signatures listed didn't match the board members serving at that time. In fact, one of the signatures belonged to a member who had moved out of the neighborhood 5 months earlier. Another name belonged to someone who wasn't even on the board. Someone had forged the approval. Someone had fabricated the entire amendment. My breathing grew shallow as I grabbed my laptop and pulled up the HOA's official documents I had downloaded earlier. I compared every line, every date, every signature. The inconsistencies jumped out, and they weren't small. Entire rule changes had been inserted without proper procedure. Vote counts were altered. Approval sections were left blank but stamped later. The more I read, the more I realized this wasn't negligence. This was intentional manipulation. Caroline hadn't been enforcing the rules. She had been inventing them. And worse, she had done it with the help of her so-called board. 3 neighbors who acted more like puppets than leaders. Their names appeared on every fraudulent document, always in agreement, always perfectly aligned with whatever power Caroline gained. Yet none of them ever attended meetings. None ever spoke publicly. They existed only on paper, supporting votes that never took place. My chest tightened with a mix of fear and a rising, determined anger. I wasn't just dealing with a hostile HOA president. I was dealing with someone who had built a fraudulent system around herself, and she was using it to target me. While I was sitting there, piecing everything together, my phone buzzed. It was Officer Grant. His voice was quieter this time, less confrontational, and more weary. "Listen," he said. "Caroline called the station again, sounding different, agitated. She's not letting this go, Ethan. She's cornered. And people like her don't react well when they feel trapped." His warning hit me harder than I expected. I thanked him and hung up, letting the silence fill the room. The weight of what I had discovered pressed on my shoulders. I could feel the danger shifting, growing sharper. Caroline wasn't going to retreat, she was going to explode. But I wasn't scared the way I had been weeks ago. Now I had something solid. Proof. Evidence. A roadmap of her corruption laid out in forged signatures and manipulated bylaws. And for the first time, I felt the power shift ever so slightly in my direction. As I gathered the papers to lock them away, a flicker of movement outside my window caught my attention. I walked to the blinds and peeked out. A new camera had been installed across the street, and it was aimed directly at my home. A letter on my porch read, "You have 72 hours before lien action begins." I had never even been late paying dues. For a moment, I just stood there staring at the paper, unable to breathe. The morning air felt thick, humid, almost sticky against my skin as I picked it up. The bold red lettering smeared slightly where the ink had bled into the cheap envelope, but the message was unmistakable. Caroline was escalating again. Faster, harder, and with more desperation than before. Inside the envelope was a stack of new violations, each one more absurd than the last. Unmaintained garden bed. Unauthorized decorative item. Improper trash bin alignment. It read like a checklist of anything she could possibly weaponize. She didn't even try to make the accusations believable anymore. She just needed quantity, noise, paper trails she could use to justify the threats she was unleashing. But the worst was the final page, a statement claiming I was in serious arrears on my HOA dues. A complete fabrication. I had the bank statements to prove it. She didn't care. Facts didn't matter to her, not when she had fear to throw around. By noon, the harassment took a darker turn. 3 anonymous letters appeared in my mailbox, each one typed, each accusing me of being a volatile presence, a danger to the community. A man residents no longer felt safe living near. One letter claimed I had screamed at elderly neighbors. Another said I was keeping weapons in the garage. Lies. Every last one. But crafted to paint a picture she desperately wanted people to believe. And then the most ridiculous citation showed up. Unauthorized guests. She had counted Officer Grant's visits as non-approved visitors violating neighborhood policy. She literally blamed me for the police she herself kept calling on me. It would have been laughable if it didn't feel so suffocating. I tried to keep calm, tried to focus on gathering evidence, but Caroline wasn't done. She appeared in the street that evening as I stepped outside with my trash bag. The sunset cast a warm glow across the pavement, but Caroline's face looked almost ghostly under it. She stormed toward me, heels clicking hard enough to echo. "Stop playing games, Ethan," she screamed, loud enough that people watering their lawns stopped mid-motion. "You think you can threaten me? Intimidate me? You think your little legal words scare me?" Her voice cracked, a shrill pitch slicing through the air. For the first time, people weren't looking at me like the supposed menace she wanted them to see. They were looking at her. At the shaking hands, the flushed cheeks, the fury spilling out in a way she couldn't control anymore. Humiliation burned through me. Not from her words, but from the sheer spectacle she was forcing onto my life. Yet beneath that sting was something stronger, something steadier. Resolve. I straightened my shoulders and met her glare without backing down. "Caroline," I said quietly, "this has gone far enough." That simple sentence enraged her more than any accusation ever could. She pointed her finger at me like she wished it were a knife. "You will comply." Neighbors watched. Some whispered, others stepped back, and for the first time I saw doubt in their faces, not about me, but about her. Caroline spun around and stormed off, shaking with fury. Minutes later, after she disappeared inside her house, I returned to my porch. A large red envelope sat waiting for me. Bold letters stamped across the front read, "Final notice." Grant arrived at my door without knocking. "You need to hear this," he said, breathing hard. Caroline crossed a line. The urgency in his voice pulled me instantly into the moment. It wasn't like the other times, the forced professionalism, the strained annoyance, the careful distance. This time he looked unsettled, almost angry, his jaw tense as he stepped past me into the living room without waiting for permission. He ran a hand across his forehead, pacing once before turning to face me. "She just called the station again," he said. "Only this time she reported you as violent." My stomach flipped. "Violent? Based on what?" He shook his head, disgusted. "Nothing. Absolutely nothing. She said you lunged at her. That you threatened her safety. She claimed you were becoming unpredictable and the neighborhood was afraid of you." He paused, staring at me with an expression that made me realize just how serious this had become. If she keeps filing these kinds of reports, someone in the department is going to escalate it. And that's exactly what she wants. For a moment, the room felt smaller, my walls pressing inward. The idea that Caroline was intentionally trying to get me arrested, or worse, landed like a punch to the ribs. But before fear could fully swallow me, Grant lifted a hand. "Show me everything," he said. I led him to the EOS dining table, where folders were stacked in uneven piles. Violations, letters, photos, timestamps, emails. He flipped through them quickly, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to outright anger. "She counted my own visits as violations? She accused you of unauthorized guests because I was here responding to her calls?" He let out a short, humorless laugh. "She's not just misusing HOA authority. She's weaponizing police resources." Hearing him say it out loud sent a wave of relief through me. Heavy, emotional grounding relief. For weeks, I'd been treated like the problem, the outsider, the threat. Now someone else finally saw what I was dealing with. Someone with a badge. Someone who mattered. Grant placed one of the violation letters down slowly, deliberately. "You need to file official complaints," he said. "Multiple ones. Internal affairs for the false reports. State HOA ombudsman for the fabricated violations. County clerk for the fraudulent documents. Don't wait. The more documentation you have, the harder it becomes for her to twist this." I nodded, swallowing against the knot building in my throat. "I've been collecting everything," I said quietly. "I just didn't know if it would matter." "It matters," he said firmly. "Trust me. People like Caroline, when they feel power slipping, they get reckless, and reckless means dangerous." His words were heavy, but there was something else under them too. Belief. For the first time, Someone believed me without hesitation, without suspicion, without waiting for Caroline's version first. The relief that washed over me was so intense it almost hurt. I felt like I'd been holding my breath for weeks and could finally inhale. But the moment didn't last. Grant stepped closer, lowering his voice until it barely carried across the room. "Ethan," he said, eyes sharp with warning. "She made a mistake this time." He paused. "A mistake she can't undo." I spread out mountains of paperwork on my dining table. I wasn't scared anymore. I was preparing for war. For weeks, Caroline had pushed me, cornered me, twisted the truth, and tried to weaponize authority against me. But Grant's warning had ignited something inside me, something sharp, focused, and unshakably determined. I had spent years buried in municipal codes and compliance manuals. I knew how to trace misconduct, how to document patterns, how to dismantle false authority brick by brick. And now, staring at the piles of evidence I had collected, I finally felt ready to use that training. The first step was filing complaints. Not just one, several. I drafted a formal submission to the state HOA ombudsman detailing the fraudulent rules, the forged vote counts, the fabricated violations, and the bylaw amendments Caroline had illegally inserted. I attached copies of every document, highlighted inconsistencies, and provided a timeline of every suspicious action she'd taken. Then I formatted a separate complaint for the county clerk's office, outlining the procedural abuses and forged approvals. And finally, I filed an internal review request with the police department for Caroline's repeated false reports claiming I was violent. With each submission, a weight lifted off my shoulders, not because I expected instant results, but because every complaint added another layer of protection between me and her lies. Then I did something Caroline never expected. I issued a lawful records request to the HOA under our state's transparency statutes. She was obligated to respond in a set number of days, no exceptions. Meeting minutes, financial statements, board approvals, violation documentation. Everything she had been hiding behind closed doors now had to be revealed. Within 24 hours, the cracks in her fortress began to show. Her emails, usually polished and authoritative, suddenly turned messy. Sloppy sentences, typos, rushed explanations. She kept insisting that all documents are in order, but refused to attach anything. She blamed software errors, staff issues, lost files, anything to avoid handing over the truth. One email arrived at 2:17 a.m., rambling and barely coherent. Another contradicted itself entirely. It was the first time I realized she wasn't just angry. She was scared, desperate, losing control, and people were noticing. Neighbors who had previously avoided getting involved started sending quiet messages. "I've seen how she's treating you. If you need a statement, let me know. She's gone too far this time." A couple even stopped me on my evening walk, glancing around nervously before admitting they had felt intimidated by her for years. It wasn't loud support, it wasn't public, but it was enough to remind me I wasn't alone, and enough to tell me that Caroline's grip on the neighborhood was slipping. Still, I knew this wasn't over. Everything I had done, every complaint filed, every request submitted, was only the beginning. The real battle would happen face to face, in a room where Caroline could no longer hide behind forged signatures or anonymous letters. The HOA meeting was coming, and every step of her unraveling was pushing her closer to a confrontation she wasn't prepared for. Then on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, my phone buzzed. A new email. From Caroline. Subject line: Emergency HO meeting, mandatory attendance. But when I clicked it open, I froze. My name wasn't on the attendee list. She had scheduled the emergency meeting and deliberately excluded me. The room went silent the moment I walked in. Caroline screamed, "You're not allowed here." I set my recorder on the table and said, "Yes, I am." Every head in the room turned toward me. Neighbors, board members, even the people who usually pretended not to know what was happening. They all watched as Caroline's face drained of color, then flushed bright red, her expression twisting into pure panic. She clutched her binder like it was a lifeline, but her hands were trembling too violently to hide. "This is a closed meeting," she snapped, voice cracking. "Members only." "I am a member," I replied calmly, pulling a printed document from my folder. "And under state HOA governance statutes, no member can be excluded from an emergency meeting unless there's a legally documented safety concern." "Which you don't have." Murmurs rippled across the room. A couple of neighbors exchanged glances, others leaned forward in their chairs. Caroline stepped back, visibly rattled. She opened her mouth to argue, but I raised my voice slightly, not shouting, just loud enough for the room to hear. "I'd like the minutes to reflect that I am present and participating," I said, tapping my recorder. "And that the president attempted to block a member's legal right to attend." Gasps. Actual gasps. Caroline tried to speak, but what came out was a strained stutter. You can't, you're twisting everything." I didn't give her time to recover. I placed a second folder on the center table and opened it slowly, deliberately. "These," I said, "are the bylaw amendments you claim were approved 3 months ago." I lifted the forged signature page. "This signature belongs to a man who moved out half a year earlier. This one belongs to someone who was not on the board. And this document," I held up another, "was stamped on a date where no meeting exists in the records." The room erupted in whispers. One woman pressed her hand to her mouth. A man in the back muttered, "Are you kidding me?" Caroline lunged forward, slamming her palm on the table. "Stop it. That is confidential material." "No," I said sharply. "It's evidence." I turned a page. Evidence of fraudulent rule changes, forged approvals, and targeted harassment. Her eyes widened, and for the first time since this war began, she looked genuinely frightened. "You don't know what you're doing," she hissed, voice shaking. "You're going to ruin everything." "No, Caroline," I replied calmly. "You already did that." Suddenly the door to the meeting room swung open. Every head turned as Officer Grant stepped inside, scanning the room with a sharp, assessing look. Someone from the meeting must have called him, maybe expecting to report me again. But the moment he saw the papers on the table and Caroline's wild expression, he understood exactly what was happening. "What's going on here?" he asked, stepping forward. Caroline pointed at me, frantic. "Officer, he's disrupting the meeting and he's not allowed." Grant held up a hand. "Ma'am, unless this resident is violating the law, you have no authority to remove him." Her mouth snapped shut. The tension broke like a dam. Neighbors spoke up, finally. "She's been forging documents," one said. "She threatened me last month," another added. Voices rose, colliding with one another until the entire room felt like it was vibrating. Caroline tried to shout over them, but her voice drowned beneath the chaos. She slammed her binder closed, then opened it, then slammed it again. She lost every ounce of composure she'd clung to for months. And then, in the middle of the uproar, one of the board members stood. "I move," he said loudly, "that we vote on the removal of Caroline Mercer as HOA president." The room fell silent. The vote was about to begin. When the final vote was read, Caroline stopped breathing for a second. It was over. She knew it. Her shoulders sagged first, then her grip loosened on the binder she had been clutching like a shield all night. It slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a dull thud that echoed through the meeting room. Everyone heard it. Everyone watched her, and for the first time since she had seized control of the HOA, she looked small, powerless, human in a way she never wanted anyone to see. One by one, the board members lowered their hands, confirming the tally. 3 votes in favor of removal. 0 opposed. 1 abstained. Caroline's reign, built on forged documents, intimidation, and fear, collapsed right there in front of her, collapsing like a poorly constructed wall finally meeting gravity. "You can't do this," she whispered, her voice barely carrying across the room. "You can't just take my authority." But her authority had never belonged to her in the first place. It had belonged to the community she had bullied, manipulated, and misled. It belonged to the residents she treated like obstacles instead of neighbors. "If you have concerns," One board member said stiffly, "You may address them through the proper appeals process." The words were clinical, cold, procedural. Exactly the tone Caroline had used on countless homeowners she'd targeted. Now it came back to her with all the force she'd once enjoyed wielding. Officer Grant stood beside me, arms crossed, watching her unravel. His expression wasn't triumphant, just resigned. He had seen people like her before, people who built illusions around themselves so tightly that truth felt like violence. She tried to gather her papers, but they slipped out of her hands. She dropped to her knees, scrambling to pick them up, fingers shaking, breath ragged. The room stayed silent. No one stepped forward to help her, not even the neighbors who once followed her orders without question. In the silence that followed, the board announced the next step. A temporary interim president would take over until a formal election. It felt surreal. After everything, after the violations, the harassment, the lies, her downfall happened in minutes. As people began filing out, Officer Grant touched my arm lightly. "I owe you an apology," he said, meeting my eyes. "I should have seen it earlier. I'm sorry I didn't." His words hit deeper than I expected. It had been a long time since anyone in authority acknowledged what I was going through. "You were doing your job," I said quietly. "She knew how to manipulate the system." He nodded slowly. "Well, the system is going to take a hard look at her now." He paused. "There's already a complaint being opened at the county level for fraudulent documentation, and the department is issuing her an official warning for misuse of police services. They don't take that lightly." Hearing that sent a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion through me. Not triumph. At least not the loud celebratory kind. It was quieter, heavier. A victory earned through bruises you couldn't see, through sleepless nights, through fear you disguised as anger. By the time I got home, the sky had turned a deep indigo, the kind that swallows the last traces of daylight. For the first time in weeks, my house didn't feel like a battleground. No new violations, no flashing cameras, no neighbors staring at me like I carried some invisible danger. Just quiet. It felt foreign, and it felt good. Over the next few days, the neighborhood slowly settled into a strange calm. People walked their dogs without glancing nervously at my house. Kids played outside again. Conversations happened on front lawns instead of behind blinds. The tension Caroline had built like a fortress began to dissolve. For the first time in a long time, peace didn't feel impossible. But peace never lasts long in battles like this. On the fourth morning after the vote, as I stepped outside to grab my mail, I froze. A letter sat alone in my mailbox, cream-colored, heavy paper, stamped with a law firm's emblem. It was from Caroline's attorney. And whatever came next, it wasn't going to be an apology. Her lawyer's letter didn't threaten me. It begged for a settlement. That told me everything about how scared she really was. I stood in my living room, staring at the envelope as though it might burst into flames. The language inside was painfully polite, almost desperate. Her attorney humbly requested that I agree not to pursue further legal action in exchange for a quiet, confidential resolution. No admission of wrongdoing, no accountability, just silence in exchange for peace. Peace had been stolen from me for months. Silence was what allowed her to operate in the first place. I folded the letter once, then again, and set it aside. I didn't shred it. I didn't burn it. I didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, I wrote a short email to her lawyer. "I decline your client's offer. This matter will proceed through proper channels." No anger, no theatrics, just a statement of fact. And sending it felt better than any settlement ever could. In the days that followed, something remarkable began happening. The HOA, free from Caroline's death grip, started unraveling the mess she'd left behind. The interim president called an open meeting where, for the first time in months, residents could actually speak without fear of retaliation. People voiced concerns, frustrations, even fear. And without Caroline there to glare them into silence, the truth flowed easily. One board member confessed they'd signed things they didn't understand because they were afraid of upsetting her. Another admitted Caroline kept documents in her personal home office instead of the HOA files. The community collectively realized how much damage just one person could inflict when no one questioned them. And slowly, the community began to rebuild. New transparency reforms were drafted. Voting procedures were clarified. All financial records were to be stored in a shared, publicly accessible digital archive. Members voted for mandatory quarterly meetings so no one could quietly rewrite rules ever again. The atmosphere around the neighborhood grew lighter. Conversations happened more freely, and people began to reclaim the sense of community that had been buried under Caroline's control. Neighbors who had once avoided me stopped to talk. One older couple thanked me for sticking it out when everyone else was too scared. A young mother admitted Caroline had threatened her over a plastic tricycle left on her porch. Another man told me he had nearly moved out because of the constant harassment he'd faced. Every thank you felt surreal. I hadn't set out to be some neighborhood crusader. I had just wanted my home, my peace back. But somewhere along the way, my personal battle had turned into something bigger. A fight for the entire community. Yet even with all the reforms and relief, I couldn't shake the unease that lingered in the back of my mind. Standing up for your rights feels righteous, empowering even, but it also reveals how fragile those rights can be when someone determined enough decides to target you. I realized how easily people give up their power just to avoid conflict, and how quickly a bully fills the void, and that's the part that stayed with me the most. People don't lose their rights, they surrender them when they're afraid. But once you learn to stand firm, once you confront the person who thrives on intimidation, their entire power structure collapses. So to anyone listening, anyone who has dealt with an abusive HOA, or a controlling neighbor, or a petty authority figure, I'll ask you the same thing I had to ask myself. What would you have done if someone tried to take away your peace, one violation at a time? Would you fight back? Would you document everything? Would you stand your ground even when it felt like you were standing alone? Because here's the truth. I wasn't standing alone, and neither are you. Life settled into something close to normal again. Quiet mornings, no pounding on the door, no cameras pointed at my windows, no forged rules taped to my mailbox. For the first time in months, I could breathe without checking over my shoulder. But just when I thought the storm had passed, something changed. It started with a single email notification, a name I recognized, a subject line that made my skin crawl. Because I later discovered, Caroline wasn't finished with me.